Bonjour, and welcome back to Learn French Brooklyn, the podcast. Today, we're talking to Kate from Unintentionally Frenchified. You can find her content on YouTube, by the way, where she highlights aspects of French culture and language. And together, we chatted about very interesting topics such as the struggle of speaking French when you are shy, the pros and cons of the French work culture, and bilingual education. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode. Hi, Kate. Welcome on the podcast. So I wanted to go back to the origins of your French learning experience. What made you learn French in the first place out of all languages?
So, the reason that I really chose French is I actually started learning French when I was in middle school in the US, so equivalent to collège. We had to choose a language to start learning. And I come from a family of lots of girls, and I have older sisters, and they all chose French. So, of course, I did what everyone else did, and I chose French. So, there wasn't really, so when I was in middle school and in high school, that's the language that I was learning. And then what really caught for me is my father took all of the girls to a weekend away in Paris. It was a very last minute trip, and we spent 4 days weekend. It was a long weekend. We spent 4 days in Paris, and I was 16 years old. And I remember at the time saying to all of my sisters and my dad, I'm going to learn French and I'm going to live here. And they're all like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And honestly, it sparked something. And when I went off to college, I decided that I wanted to also major in French. I wanted to take part of my classes in French. I really wanted to learn. I wanted to study abroad in France, etc. But the ball really started rolling when I was 16, I would say, on that trip.
Okay. And so at the time you were studying French in school,
Yes.
was it sort of was it very grammar focused, or was it a mix of culture and speaking?
I would say it was mostly grammar. I mean, at least what I remember, it was really grammar focused. And I don't remember, this is obviously my own personal journey, but I don't really feel like I learned a lot in my middle school and high school days. I don't know how attentive you were in your language classes when you were in middle school and high school, but it wasn't like something that I found that interesting, or it wasn't something that I enjoyed doing. I mean, trying to learn like verbs and how to conjugate and the passé composé and the subjonctif, like none of that was like I found very exciting. What I found exciting was the cultural part of it when we were in France, when we were eating, when we were hearing things, all of that was fun, but the actual like hardcore learning, I mean, the grammar wasn't that enjoyable.
And so I believe right now you're learning Spanish, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
was French your the first foreign language that you learned?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. It's always been French. We had a choice between French and Spanish. And in some schools in the US, you have more options. Actually, we had three options. We had French, we had Spanish, and we had German. So French was
Okay.
the only thing that I started learning, and I kind of stuck with it. And I've said in a couple of my videos, I feel like I restarted over learning French 3 times. I feel like I started learning French when I was in middle school, and I took it for the first time. And yes, I learned, but I don't think anything really like soaked in. Then when I went to college, there was another very like I restarted at zero in a very beginner class and really wanted to like get into it and work and everything. And then once I finished college and I actually moved abroad to France, to me that was a whole nother restart at zero, like actually getting immersed in the culture, actually really starting to speak to French people, being forced to speak. For me, that was like something that really I feel like, again, of course there was some base knowledge I had from learning it in the classrooms for so many different times and for so many different years, but actually being in France, that to me was the click, and that's what really changed, and it really made a huge difference.
And before moving to France, were you in any way sprinkling a bit of French culture outside of class, like watching French movies or things like that?
I don't think I did a great job of that. And to be fair, so I've been living in France now for 10 years. And if I think back to what was available in terms of resources when I was learning French, we didn't have Netflix, there wasn't YouTube. I'm not saying that if I hadn't have been more proactive, I couldn't have found resources. Like in French, I don't want to say they weren't anywhere. The internet did exist when I was in middle school, but it really wasn't like that popular yet. So yes, like we had some movies, or there was some things shown in class, like we would watch Disney like films that we already knew in French, but it's not like it is today, where today there's like a plethora. I mean, there is so many resources to get involved in a language that's not just grammar related. I mean, you have to learn the basics. You have to learn kind of like the rough part. Or, I mean, and there is a lot of memorization no matter what at some point in your language journey, but I think there's a lot more interactive ways to get excited about a language and to stay motivated than maybe I had at that time when I was really in a classroom focused setting.
And so you mentioned that there was a real threshold when you moved to France.
Yes.
What was the biggest challenge you would say that you faced at that point?
For me, it was being shy. That was such a huge challenge for me, was actually starting to speak up. I honestly remember like the when I first arrived in France and I was 19 and it was to study abroad and I was in Paris and I was hungry and I walked out of my hotel and there was a stand like really close by that was selling crepes and we were like near a really touristy place and I stood in line and I got so nervous because everyone was shouting and yelling out things that I just left the line. And like this guy absolutely spoke English and there would have been no problem. And you can point with your hands, but it's just so nerve-wracking, and even like one-on-one is even very different. I don't know, but for me, for example, I actually felt going into a boulangerie for the first time and speaking very stressful because there's a line of people behind you, there's a line of people in front of you, and the boulangerie is screaming like, and what do you want? And you're like a baguette, and I don't know, I just found like the actual speaking in front of other people to be very, very uncomfortable. And the thing is you don't get better until you start speaking. And so that was a huge challenge for me. Huge
Mm-hmm.
challenge. I guess you can learn so much, as you said, by listening to shows, and you learn so much by reading and by writing and studying grammar, and that gets you really far. But there's a point where you have to speak it as well. And it's just even the way that we learn, other people, the way that we learn our first language. Like I have a little daughter and she's 14 months and she doesn't really speak yet, but she understands in French and English tons of stuff. We can say, go get a book and I'll say it in English and my French will say it in my husband will say it in French and she'll go and do it, but she can't talk back yet. So it's normal that that's like probably the last thing that you can do, even when you understand people, etc. But I feel like that's the hardest one to really get over.
That makes sense. Yeah, I can totally see that. And speaking of sort of challenges, I was wondering if you still feel like today there are some parts of the French language that are more challenging than others.
Absolutely. For me, I think the most challenging is some grammar stuff. Shocker, surprise, surprise. But because I do speak French fluently now, the vocabulary, like the certain phrases that you need to know, the things that maybe they didn't teach you in a classroom, but that you learn on the street, all of those things I get. And even I work in French, so even like the office vocabulary that like you pick up as you start to be involved. But for me, there's some parts of French grammar that are quite difficult. So I mentioned the subjunctive, but I'm going to say it again. There are certain compositions of verbs that I don't do well. And so what I tend to do now that I speak French well enough is construct my sentences so that I don't have to use the subjunctive. So what that
Yeah.
does mean is that I don't know how to use it very well. And so I actually feel like there's this point where you plateau, where for me, I've plateaued because I found a way around the things I'm uncomfortable saying, or I found ways, and so I've always, I've been saying I totally need to take a class that forces me to go that extra step and get up there, because at some point my French has just kind of plateaued um,
Mm-hmm.
like that. And then I also find pronunciation to be quite difficult. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I've done a couple of videos in French. I speak French fluently. I'm comfortable saying that, but I have a very thick American accent. And it doesn't matter that I've been speaking French, living in France for 10 years. I say bonjour, and everyone's like, you're from the UK, the US? And I'm like, yes. So
No,
quite difficult.
I
I
can
still find
understand.
that to be difficult today.
But if that can make you feel better, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of French people do the same thing with when it comes to using the subjunctive.
Mhm.
Nobody wants to use the subjunctive, so we all do this sort of long road instead of using the
Yes.
subjunctive. It's part of the French grammar, I guess. And so I was very interested because you mentioned you work in French, which is like a
Yes.
whole different level of French speaking.
Yeah.
Um, so how did that? Were you always working in French in France, or is that recent?
So I've been working in France. Yes, I've been living here for 10 years now in France. I actually got my French nationality this year, so I am
Oh,
officially a
congrats. Wow.
Franco-American, which is
Okay.
which is
So you have
very
two passports?
exciting. Yes, I do. So I was really excited about
Awesome.
that. So when I moved to France, I studied for a year, did my master's, and then right away I started an internship, and I've been working, either interning or working since then. And almost all of my jobs have been in French and in pretty Franco-French environments. I work now for a really large international beauty company. And so I have to admit that everybody around me now is a very international, speaks English, et cetera. But in some of my positions, there was no opportunity to speak English and you had to speak French. And that was terrifying at the beginning. I think I've said in some of my videos before that when you get into a company that's very international and they're okay with people speaking English, then it's not necessarily a problem to get your day to day job done without speaking French. But if you don't speak French, you really lose out on those connections that you can make at work because even if the meetings aren't in French, the coffee breaks are in French, the jokes are in French, the drinks out are in French. So it's important, to learn even if you don't have to in your job. And so I think in my very first position, when I had to actually speak French for my job, that was quite nerve wracking because you're not as sharp as you want to be. You're not as clear. I remember multiple examples I won't use here that are quite vulgar, but I would repeat things that my husband, I would hear at home, the way that he spoke, like with his brothers or with his family, and very like familiar, terms that I would say in like a very important meeting, and people afterwards would be like, that's not exactly how to address things in front of the CEO. And I'm like, oh, really? I didn't know. So it's totally a learning experience. But I do think that if you're in a company that appreciates international profiles, they appreciate so much having someone that speaks French. Like when you're actually making that effort, I don't think that if I was in a job today where the person needed to be 100% French and the job was only in French, that my profile would be the right fit because even if I've been here for so long, I make mistakes and I don't say things perfectly. And it's just part of having someone who's not a native French speaker. But as soon as you're in a job role where it's for a more international profile and then it's an added bonus that you speak French, that's where I felt the most comfortable.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
true
even
that
after 10 years.
no, that makes sense. But especially what you said about your husband, like measuring the amount of seriousness of idioms and things like that. Is it something appropriate for
Yes.
work or not? That's something that you never learn in school. So that's
No,
super
not
difficult
at all. And
to
it's
measure.
so easy to make mistakes because
Mhm.
the way that you speak, and it's not the same in English, but the way that you speak with your friends or your family wouldn't at all be the same way necessarily that you would speak at work. And when I don't even, and I really pay attention to that now, but at the beginning, I wasn't so aware of the familiar way that I spoke French and how maybe not appropriate some of it was in the workplace until I had a couple of incidents. And now I pay a bit more attention to that. Mm.
That makes sense. Um, and so still about your work experience in
Mhm.
French, you mentioned in a few of your videos the difference in terms of work-life balance between like France and the US.
Yes.
What are the main like pros and cons you would say in terms of working in France?
Yeah. I always say the biggest pro, I cannot lie, is the vacation time. I mean, it is
Mm,
amazing in
yeah, the
France.
5 weeks of
I mean,
PTO is
exactly, it's awesome
quite
compared to the
something.
US. It's awesome, and I know a lot of my American friends my age are starting in the US. Benefits and vacation time is starting to get higher and higher in the sense that vacation time in the US doesn't have like a federal law the same way really that it does in France. So it's very dependent on the company that you work for, the state that you live in, or it's just not done in the same way. Whereas in France, everybody has to have 5 weeks, and that's how it is at least. And in my company today, I think I have something like 40 days or something. So it's really, really. That includes like RTT extra days, but in total, I get to choose 40 days off during the year. So that's just like not. not something that we have in the US. So I would say that that is a huge pro. And then obviously, because I'm American too, we don't have a lot of job security in the US. So in terms of being fired or let go, that can happen very quickly. And so you can very much be going from like earning a salary to earning nothing the next day, really. That can happen. And so for me, the job security in France is a huge plus for that, feeling very stable in your situation and knowing that financially that's not going to be ripped out of you, like out from under you like from the one day to the next normally. So I think that's a huge positive of working in France. So yeah, the work-life balance, the vacation, the stability that you have. I would say if I had to say some of the cons, I would say that in France, I mean, it's all linked to the pros, I guess, but the job stability means that I think it's quite hard to get hired. It's quite hard to move jobs. Getting like a CD, once you're in a job, because it is quite difficult to fire someone, it means that it's also quite difficult to get hired. And so I think people are less interested in switching jobs and switching careers and changing career paths. Like if you're 30 or 35 in the US and you decide like, hey, this really isn't for me, I want to switch things up. The US tends to favor transversal skills a bit more in France. I don't know if you feel this way, but I've been working in marketing. I don't know, I would say for the past 10 years. If all of a sudden I wanted to, I don't know, go to HR, which is still, I mean, still business oriented, still in a corporate company like I've been working in, that jump would be a lot more difficult for me to make in France, I feel like, than it would be in the US. So I would say that sometimes for me, that's kind of a con. Um, and so, yeah, that means that I think you get kind of pigeonholed in your role, what you've been doing. In France, I always say, like, when you guys go to high school, already in high school, you're kind of saying, like, in high school, I'm going to do this. So then in college, I'm going to do this. And then after that, here's my job career. And it's great to have that type of direction. But then there's not a lot of room, there's not a lot of flexibility in the French system to say, like, never mind, I'll change.
Yeah, it's true. Even I feel like going back to school is something that's way more common in the US than here. Once you pass like 40, nobody goes back to school
Yeah.
here. So that's
Yeah,
also a
no, for
big
sure.
big difference. So you made a very very interesting video that tackles the issue of French people complaining. And
Yes.
so I was wondering if since you've been here for quite some time now, do you feel like there are parts of the French like mindset that grew on you?
Yes, absolutely. Even the things that I could like complain about the French have totally grown on me. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
hard not to be in a culture. It's funny because I don't feel 100% American anymore and I don't feel 100% French. I mean, I feel like a bit of a mix, which is probably why I say it's like unintentionally French. Like, no, I'm not 100% French, but there's so many things that you pick up and that you appreciate like living over here. So for example, like the work-life balance. I mean, obviously I'm generalizing things, right? Everybody's not like this in the US, but and a lot of times in the US, we really is like time is money. It's all about, making a good salary, work, work, work. And I love this idea in France that it's so much about appreciating life. Like that to me is just like so great that it's really about like, I'm more than ready to take a cut in salary if you told me I could have 3-day weekends for the rest of my life. Like there's this thing about like you don't need money doesn't need to be like the driving force. And I felt like I got a lot of that more on like the American side. So that's something that I feel like has been a bit more culture wise, a bit more French. I love long meals now. In the US, when we go and we eat, it's like a 45-minute thing. You go out, you eat really quick. I mean, even in restaurants, and you get shoved out the door quite quickly for a lot of different reasons, but it just everything's so quick in the US and so fast. Like at where I work, I think it's quite common for people to take at least an hour for lunch, if not an hour and a half. And in the US, it was way more like eat at your desk or something like that. It wasn't the same, I guess, getting to relax and take your time. So that's something that I've really enjoyed that I used to think was quite weird. I don't know if this is something that's more Parisian sometimes, especially on my videos. People will be like, that's not a French thing, that's a Parisian thing. And I have lived in other cities besides Paris, but it's true that the last 7 years I've lived in Paris. And I find that in my personality, I'm still, I would say, very positive. That's part of, being American, I think, compared to French, is that, like, as you said, the French tend to be complain a bit more. They tend to like to debate, to see a bit more of the negative side of things. But afterwards, when they complain, they don't really care. I mean, it's not a big deal because I'm complaining. Whereas in the US, we tend to be like super positive. And so when somebody says something negative, it's because it's a really big deal. And I feel like I still kept that positivity, but I wouldn't say that I'm as friendly and as smiley with strangers as I used to be. I think you still find that side of me with friends, but there's a lot of stranger danger in France compared to the US, where we tend to be this overly friendly with people we don't know. So I'd say that's also a bit more of the French, maybe Parisian mentality that I've picked up. Um, and then, I mean, of course, everything related to food. I've never eaten so much bread in my life, or like having a meal without a baguette now. That even if it's very cliche, it's very much a part of the French culture that I think I've picked up as well.
So you mentioned that you have a 14-month-old daughter
Yes.
that's starting to understand both French and English. So that's very
Yes.
exciting. And I was wondering if you have already planned on sending her to like a French school taught in French, or bilingual school.
So we have this conversation regularly with my husband about it's insane when you have kids, the topic of education comes up all the time. So I do love the idea of Eleanor going to a bilingual school. Or, for example, if we're living in France, going to a school that's 100% in English, or if we were living in the US, going to a school that was 100% in French, because I do feel like if she's getting all of that language in, weekends and visits with friends outside of school, she's getting another language, then in school, it would be great if she had that language. To be very transparent, the cost of bilingual schools in Paris is very expensive. And so while I think that that could be a great, something great for her to do to go to a bilingual school, I don't think it's necessary for her to learn English to go to a bilingual school. She's going to speak English because that's the only language that I speak to her. Or with my husband, he's going to speak French if that's the only thing. She's going to speak French because that's the only thing that he speaks to her. But I do think that if we don't send her to a bilingual school because the price is just not affordable for us, that I think it's important to put her in activities where she can hear English. It's important to go to maybe classes at the American Institute or at the British Institute or at any, language learning classes that she can do every Wednesday or on Saturdays, or just kind of try our best to find little pockets of culture and of English speaking things that we can do all together as a family at some point. Because if we can't, if it's not affordable to do a bilingual school, then we'll just have to make it happen in another way.
Thank you, Kate, once again for your participation. You can find Kate's channel on YouTube, Unintentionally Frenchified.